Hello, everyone. So
Hey,
welcome to our first Angular London online meetup. This is a bit of an experiment for us. Hopefully it's all going to go smoothly, but bear with us if it doesn't. So the idea is to run some of these, hopefully not always from my bedroom, over the summer. We've got a couple lined up. Pete starting. Thank you very much, Pete. And another one coming in a couple of weeks' time. And what we'd like to do is, if you would like to speak, please get in touch with us. We'd love to get some of the community speaking. And this is going to be more of the formal part of the evening. And afterwards, we're going to post a link to a Zoom chat, which won't be recorded, and just to give you a networking opportunity and an opportunity to chat with each other and carry on the conversation. So I think that's really it in terms of intros. So I'm going to hand over to Pete for him to talk a bit about Angular localization. Over to you, Pete.
thank you, Josh. It's good to see everyone today, or not see you. This is something that we haven't done before, and I'm not sure how it's going to go. I'm more used to interacting with people when I'm talking, so this is going to feel a bit strange. Anyway, today I'd like to just give you some insight into some of the things I've been doing on the Angular team over the last year or so. I've worked on a number of different projects, but one in particular that I think is quite interesting is the new Ivy localization stuff. On the surface, it hasn't changed that much at the moment. Most of the work has gone on behind the scenes, but hopefully you'll start to see some of the benefits of it soon and get to actually use some of it. So this is under the hood. So we'll get into a little bit of the detail of how it actually works rather than how you use it, because I think that that's something that's interesting and not covered in things like our docs already. I assume that you probably know who I am, hopefully, but I've been on the Angular team for a number of years. Josh, I, and Ed were responsible for setting up Angular Connect and also Angular, this meetup that we're at now. So we've been in and around Angular for a long, long time now, and it's been a great journey. I'm really excited to be continuing it. Right, so localization means lots of things to lots of different people, and even for individuals, it means lots of things. It can cover lots of different things to do with dates and formatting of your text and right to left and left to right and so on. But for today, we're just going to focus simply on translating text. So the idea here is that you have an application you've written, has text in it, and you want to be able to distribute that app to different countries that speak different languages. So you need to convert the text into different languages, for instance, like German or French here. And you can see that the actual text changes, but there's HTML in there as well, which we need to sort of understand as we're doing this. So the way that you do this traditionally in Angular, this has been working for a long time now, is that you apply these I18N attributes to your component templates. And this tells Angular that the contents of the element that has the tag of the attribute is going to be translated, and it means that Angular has to then understand the contents of this, and also we need to be able to extract that out so that we can pass those messages to a translator. And here's an example of the kind of thing that you would send to a translator. You can see that the source is the original text, but with this interpolation placeholder, which maps to the interpolation that's going on at the top. And in this case, the translator's already done their job and they've converted it to French. And they would send you back this, and then our tooling can consume this and use it to translate your application. The I18N attribute is quite sophisticated. You can use it to attach translations to attributes as well as content, and this big block in the middle, this with the minutes plural and so on, is called an ICU expression. It's basically like a switch statement, which allows us to monitor the value of this minutes object here, and it allows you, and it will then display different text depending on the value of that. and this whole block can be sent to a translator in one go, so that the translator can translate the whole block in the context in one go. So how do we normally do a translation of an application? You do what I just did on the previous slides, which is to mark all of the messages in your templates with these I18N attributes. That tells Angular which messages need to be translated. We then run a tool like ngx I18N, which will parse through those source files and pull out those messages and write them into a translation file, like an xlif file. Messages.xlf is an xlif file. That's a standard translation file format. You then send these message files off to translators, who will then send it back with the text converted into the language of choice. And then you pass these message files back into the build process, which then will generate copies of the app for each of the languages that you care about. So if you have 10 languages, then you will end up with 10 copies of the app, each one translated into the relevant language. So before we actually got to Ivy, the way that this worked was pretty much what I've just explained, but the most important feature is that the message replacement, so when you replace the original messages with translations, this actually happens during the compilation of the template. So when the Angular compiler is parsing and compiling the template, that is when it replaces the text with the translated text. So to see that more visually, what we've got here is, you can see on the left that we have component templates containing these I18N attributes and some component code and so on, and other application code. And then the Angular compiler runs, and you pass it a translation file. And the translation file then tells the Angular compiler what to replace these messages with. And then the output of that is a translated application. But it hasn't been bundled or minified yet. So then it has to go through the pipeline of bundling and going through the minifier. And then finally, you get a production file out the other end, which is in a particular language. So if you imagine how long this takes, you could say that maybe the compiler takes 30 seconds, the bundler's 90 seconds, the minifier another 60 seconds. So that's a 3-minute build for your whole app, to build one copy of the app. Unfortunately, because we have to do this for each of the translations, if you had, say, 9 different languages that you cared about, then you would end up with 3 minutes times 9 gives you a 27-minute build time, which is quite a long time in order to push your app to production. So we wanted, one of the goals of the new Ivy translation was to try and do a better job of this. So we'll have a look at seeing how that happens now. So the first thing that we did was that we've created a new idea, which is this concept called $localize. $localize is a function, it's a global function, which would basically take a string and translate it for you. And you use this to actually tag strings in your application, either in the template or actually in your application code, as a way to tell us that this is a message that needs to be translated. The other main difference then is that instead of actually translating this code in the Angular compiler, we can leave these $localize message tags all the way through to the very, very last part of the build, after we've done the minifying and everything, and then we can actually do the translation at that point. This is what $localize would look like if you were going to use it in your own application code. What we've got is a backtick string, sometimes called a string literal, and a template string literal. And template string literals are cool because you can actually include interpolations inside them. So you can see here that this .process is actually a value that's going to be interpolated into this string. The $localize is actually called, in this context, a tag handler. And what this is saying is that the backtick string gets parsed by the compiler, and then it gets passed to the $localize function in a particular format, and then $localize is able to process this backtick string before outputting the final string. And this gives $localize an opportunity to do some transformation on this string. And of course, what it will do is it will transform it by replacing the original text with the translated text. So this is what you would imagine you could do at runtime. The function could actually be called at runtime to do this. But the clever thing about $localize being a global is that you can actually use it to tag the code statically, and then you can at compile time, you can then find all of these tagged strings and exchange the message for this translated message at compile time, and actually remove the $localize altogether. So here's how it looks in the build pipeline. So we've still got the I18N tags attributes on the component templates, but we've now also got, in the application code, we've got $localize tagged messages as well. So this is going to be something new that you'll be able to do with the Ivy translation code. And what happens now is that the Angular compiler will actually compile the I18N tags in the templates into Ivy template instructions, which contain $localize calls. And that's all it does. It doesn't do any translation at that point. It just basically tags the strings inside the generated code. And then this $localize can pass through the bundler. It goes through the minifier. The minifier won't touch it because it's a global. And then so finally, at the very end of this chain, we get a distributable file which contains these $localize calls, or these $localize tagged messages. At this point, we can then create a new tool, which is this, which I've called here Translation Replacer. And what that does is it can take a whole bunch of translation files that you've received from your translators and very quickly create a whole bunch of translated production files by just replacing the $localize tagged messages with the translated messages. So here's an idea of what the timing would look like for that. You can see that the original build time is basically the same. You know, we've still got 3 minutes to build the distributable app. But now what happens is it only takes about 5 seconds, say, for the translator to actually replace these $localize calls and tagged messages with the translated text. So you only have to do that once per locale. So you're looking at basically about 45 seconds of translation plus your 3 minutes. So that's less than 4 minutes for the whole build, whereas obviously pre-Ivy, we were looking at almost 30 minutes. So I think that this alone is a fantastic win for the Ivy translation, the work that we've done. And obviously some people we've spoken to have 50 languages, and it would take hours to build, or they would have to run the whole thing on a massive production sort of parallelism. Luckily, this is pretty much all integrated into the Angular CLI. So you don't actually have to set up this translation replacer yourself. It's already built into the current Angular CLI. So all you have to do is configure the CLI to tell it what translation files you want, and it will actually do this for you. So if you're doing translation right now, you should be able to see this in your builds. It was basically introduced late Angular 9.1, I think. I'm not going to go into how you set up the Angular CLI. You can look on the angular.io website. There's a guide there which contains pretty good instructions on configuring the CLI to do this. Okay, cool. So I spoke earlier about the fact that $localize, we use it primarily as a tag so that we can do compile time localization. But actually, it is a function, and we do actually provide an implementation of this function. So it is feasible to actually do the translation at runtime. And by runtime, I mean translating the original messages into their translated form in the browser. This has some benefits. It gives you a lot more flexibility over when the translations are provided to the application. A classic example would be if you were the kind of company that was building a white labeled product, and you provide this product to your clients, and they want to provide their own sets of translations, but they don't want to actually be building the app themselves. So you could provide them with a runtime version of your app, which and then they could just provide the translation files, and they would get loaded up and processed in the browser at runtime. There are some disadvantages to this, obviously. You've got the additional code size of the $localize implementation itself. Every $localize tagged string obviously has to have the $localize there, so that's additional code size. And there's a runtime performance cost, both in terms of actually doing the translations, but also you have to wait for the translations to load, and not often you'd be maybe loading them using a HTTP request, or even if you loaded them up as part of your bundle, it adds to the download time of your bundle. The other thing, there's a slight quirk at the moment, which is that Angular will do the translation of the template $localize calls at the point that it loads the templates, and that is basically at bootstrap time. So you need to make sure that you've loaded your translations before you bootstrap Angular, and there's some quirks around doing that, which is totally avoided. You can get around it, but you just need to be aware of it. So it's not quite as simple as it seems. The other thing to be aware of is that this doesn't mean that we can do dynamic language changing. Often when I speak to people about runtime translation, they are thinking about being able to switch from one language to another in the application without reload or anything. There is no support in $localize design for doing this. The way that you would be able to do this is if you want to switch language, you basically would do a reload of your application with a new translation. When I talk to people about runtime translation and they start talking about dynamic language switching, usually they realize that for their use case, that a reload is perfectly acceptable, because most users aren't switching backwards and forwards from one language to another throughout the day. The main reasons for this decision is basically performance-wise. The $localize messages are outside of the event of the change detection loop. If they weren't, then you would be having to run change detection on them constantly throughout the app, which would damage the performance of it. But also, there is no real clean way to tell the app that the translations have changed. And so you would basically have to rebuild the whole DOM tree anyway if you wanted to switch the translations to a new language. So there's not that much difference between that and reloading the page. Very happy to talk to people if they have ideas around that. But most of the people I've spoken to are either happy with reloads or have a very niche scenario. So the approach that we generally want to encourage is this compile time approach. And as I said before, what happens is that the $localize tagged messages survive minification. So you can see here in the middle of the screen, there is a somewhat minified bit of code, and you can see hidden in the middle of it, there is still this $localize tag handler in front of a backtick string. And what this means is that even in very heavily minified code, we can still identify these. And what we can then do is we can actually replace that completely with the translated string. So there is no $localize left in the final output distributable file at all. So we actually strip all of that out, and we end up with a much smaller distributable file. There's the runtime, the compile time. Obviously, there's no runtime cost at all then, because you're not having to actually process anything at runtime. The compile time cost is fairly small, as I showed earlier, because you can do it right at the very end of the build. And of course, it comes out of the box in the CLI, so it's pretty easy to set up. So I'd imagine like 99.9% of people would follow this approach, if not more. So how does it actually work? So when we're actually doing this translation at compile time, we've actually built it around Babel. Babel is a pretty fast parser of JavaScript. We don't need TypeScript because at this point the code has not got any typings in it anyway, and Babel is much faster than building a full TypeScript program up. Babel will parse the code into an AST, and then we use plugins to find the $localize instances, replace the nodes with the translated text, and then write it back out again. And you can see here at the bottom, the first line shows what it would have looked like before the Babel plugins run. And then afterwards, you can see that there's no longer any $localize. It just has the string concatenated together around the interpolated value. So that's most of what I was going to say about $localize. What I want to talk about for this last part of the talk is just to dig in a little bit into how the template compiler actually works with I18N and Ivy. This is something that no one really needs to worry about. It's not public. It's not something that you should worry yourself about at all. And frankly, most people in the Angular team don't worry about this. There's probably very few people who can get their head around all of this. It's really complex. But I thought it'd be interesting just to kind of dig into a little bit, but not that far. Now, why is it complex? If you think about it, if I just go back to one of these earlier pages, if we've got something like this, the first H1 has a hello string and then an interpolation. But in the translation, it's possible that the interpolation might come before the string, depending on the language that you're translating it to. Similarly, here you've got this click button here. We need potentially to be able to move the button around to different parts of the text. And so that means that the renderer needs to be able to use the translation to actually tell it to be able to know where to provide the different elements and interpolations and other things like ng4s and templates and content projection and so on. So zoom back forward again. So all of these things need to be handled by the renderer at runtime. So we need to have a form of the $localize calls that tell the renderer what needs to be done. So if you imagine this template here, we're going to compile that with Ivy, and you end up with some instruction set that looks like this. I won't go too much detail, but you can see that there's an element H1 start and an end. There's a P start and then and that ends. And within the element start, we've got this call to I18N with a variable, which we'll talk about in a second. Similarly, in the P tag, we've got a button in the middle, but then there's but that's wrapped with an I18N block. And so what we're saying here is that to the renderer is like, this block here will be a translated message, but there will be a button in there at some point. These I18N2 and I18N0 are just variables which are assigned like this. What you can see is that, again, it has $localize, and then it's a backtick string. And you can see that we've still got the hello and the click here and so on. So all the text from the original I18N message. But now we've got these really crazy, weird interpolations in the string. And I'm going to call these placeholders, or I18N markers. These are kind of markers that tell the Ivy renderer something special needs to go here. And they can be single markers like this one, or they can be a start and an end marker like this one to kind of show a block. So this this funny, weird character is actually a proper Unicode character. It's called the replacement character. We just chose it because it had a cool name, and it is unlikely to be used by anyone else. When you see it in the source code, if you start digging into the source code that the template compiler produces, you'll see it actually is usually encoded like this. So the /U means the Unicode character. FFD is just hex. So that is the same character as this question mark. And you can see on this slide that there are basically 4 types of these markers. that we've seen the top two already. So the first one is indicating that there's some kind of interpolation binding at this point. The second one implies that there is an element to be inserted at this point. These elements could be just HTML, or they could in fact be Angular components, for instance. And then if you've got something like an ngIf or an ngFor, the content of that block is actually a separate sub-template, because potentially that template will be stamped out multiple times. So there's a marker for that. And then finally, if you're using ngContent blocks, then we need to tell the compiler, the renderer, that there might be an opportunity to render a content block at this point in the message. Because there might be multiple ones of these markers in the code, in a string, you can imagine if you had multiple interpolations, you would need to have multiple markers. Each one needs to have a name, because another thing is that the translator could even move around the ordering of these interpolations or these elements. So when the template compiler generates the code, this form here is super simplified and isn't really what it actually looks like. It looks more like this. And what you can see here is that we have a special syntax, which is that if you have a colon delimited block directly after an interpolation, like a placeholder, then this is a name that gets associated with that one. So this marker has the name interpolation. This marker has the name start tag button, and the last marker has the close tag button. You can imagine that the renderer, the Ivy renderer, will be able to look at the name of this and say, start tag button. So I know that I need to insert the button start tag at this point. You'll also notice that these have numbers. The 0 and the 4 represent the numbers that appear in, for instance, like the 4 here is the 4 for the button element. So it tells you exactly which button is going to be rendered at that point. You can actually use this concept of naming your interpolation blocks yourself. So in this case, I've named my first interpolation as process_name. It doesn't have a huge benefit in the actual code, because this is not going to be processed by the Ivy runtime. This is just living inside your application code. But what it does provide is nice things like when you extract these messages into translation files, it uses these names in the, for instance, this is xlif output. And so this helps the translator understand the context of what is being displayed and what they need to translate. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to say about this is that when you're using i18n in the template, there's this quite nice feature where you can apply metadata. Anyone who's used the Angular i18n probably is aware of this. So what this says is that the first H1 message has a meaning of greeting and a description of a friendly message. And that will actually get pulled out into the translation file as well. So the translator gets to see that information. And the meaning actually affects what the ID will be generated for the message. You can do this the same with $localize tagged strings. So by having a colon delimited block, this time at the very beginning of the ticked string, backtick string, this represents a metadata block for the overall message. So we can put the same metadata into the $localize calls. And this uses exactly the same syntax as the i18n tag does. So if you know one, you can then use the other. So that's basically what I wanted to talk about. Just to quickly go over what we've talked about. When we move to the new IVINTN, we've introduced this new idea of tagging messages in the code with $localize. We use it in the generated code that comes from the Angular template compiler, but also it's now possible that you can use it in your own application code. Currently, the CLI doesn't have integration with extracting $localize from application code. But the code is ready to go in the framework, and it will probably be integrated by the time 10.1.0 gets released. If you're building lots of different copies of your application in different languages, then it's now much faster to do that. The Angular CLI pretty much supports all of this out of the box. It's a fairly straightforward process to configure it to generate all of your different copies of your application in different languages. And that being able to compile templates to support complex internationalization messages is quite complicated, and we didn't even get into the code, which is pretty mind-bending. So on top of that, there's a whole load of other things that we could have talked about, which I haven't got time for, but maybe in a future one, or if you wanted to chat later. This is a list of some of the things that are either in the pipeline, on the way, or we're thinking about, and there's lots more work to be done. Anyway, so that's all I've got to say. I'm open to questions both about this topic itself or Angular in general. I can try and answer as best I can with the knowledge I've got. So I hope that was helpful to everyone.
That was really interesting, and really interesting to take a peek behind the curtain as well of how it all works. Unfortunately, we've got a bit of a shy audience, so you need to get typing your questions now. There is one
Paul will have
a particularly handsome-looking guy. Can you see that, Pete?
What if your translation doesn't have a button? Has the button in it?
Yeah. So
I see. So the original source has a button.
Yeah.
But the translation doesn't have the button.
So
basically, for whatever reason, or any other element. So you can always remove elements from a translation, and you can move them around. What you can't do is add additional elements. And I actually saw an issue for this recently, because someone was using, in their translation, they were adding things like bold and italic elements to try and add additional formatting to the translation that wasn't in the source. And we can't support that in Ivy, because obviously we can only render the stuff that the Ivy renderer knew about at the point when we compiled the template.
I think that's quite a good thing to bear in mind then. So if you've got bold or something in your original, you can use it or take it out, but you can't add.
Yeah, exactly. So the two workarounds I'm thinking of for that is either break down your messages into slightly smaller chunks so that you can have messages within elements rather than having too many elements in the first place in your message. The other option is that apparently you can actually just add empty elements to the end of your original source. If you know that there might be an opportunity where someone will need to add a bunch of bolds and things, you can just add a whole load of empty ones at the end. They won't get rendered, and then you can then remove them in your translations if you don't need them.
Right. Okay. So we now have some questions. Here we go.
Awesome.
So from Darryl Brown, do translations work in a server render universal app?
So I'm currently in discussions with the server-side team. There's no reason why it shouldn't work, because the compile time translation is just a post-processing step. So it should be perfectly doable, but obviously currently it's not integrated into the process of actually generating the server-side code. You could, if you were feeling confident, you could probably attach it right now yourself. But if you just wait a few months, I think it will be it's certainly in the pipeline. So that it should be available out of the box at some point.
Great.
Thanks, Darryl.
Thank you for your question. Anyone else have any more questions? See, Pete's got an inside track into the Angular team, so you can widen these questions to anything within reason about Angular that you'd like to ask. Meanwhile, while we wait for someone to write a question, I will just put this up, which is our next planned meetup. So we haven't got the post live yet, but it will be still on this Facebook page, and it will be on Tuesday, the 4th of August at 5 p.m. And I've just noticed that the logo covers it slightly, but it's build a chatbot for an Angular application with Sebastian. And we look forward to welcoming it into this virtual world. And hopefully you'll join us again in a couple of weeks' time.
Basically in a couple of weeks' time, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think in general, the plan is that we're going to be trying to roll out a series of these talks over the next few months while we're all stuck in lockdown and we can't come and hang out and eat pizza and drink beer together. So if there are people out there, more questions. Okay. Will the translations work with Ionic? I'm pretty confident, again, that if you're doing compile time, I mean, there's nothing specifically Angular, there's nothing particularly Angular specific about $localize. We designed it actually to be almost completely standalone. You could use it in a non-Angular scenario if you wanted, because you can just call the $localize methods, or you can tag your messages with $localize in any way you like. I guess the question is, I don't really know enough about Ionic to say how their template processing works, if they have some special template compilation going on to work for them, or whether it's just sitting on top of the Angular compiler. But certainly if Ionic is just sitting on top of the Ivy compiler and Ivy renderer, then it would definitely work. So hopefully that helps.
So it looks like these are all the questions we have at the moment. So I will be posting on the chat a link to the Zoom call if you'd like to join us for some non-broadcast networking and chat. We'd love to see you, and hopefully you'll join us again in a couple of weeks. And thank you very much for joining our first online meetup. And
yeah. And thanks to Josh for all of the technical expertise in getting this up and running.
Pleasure. So with that, so you can come back to this and watch this again if there's any thing that you missed, or if you arrive late. This will now be available on our page, and join the page and like the page, and then you'll see the notifications when we do our next one. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
And if anyone else is interested in giving a talk over the next few months, then get in touch, because we'd love to give you opportunities to be up here on the big stage.
Bye. Thank you.